The order that mattered most on an American submarine in the Second World War was not fire and it was not dive. It was rig for silent running, and the men who heard it knew exactly what came next. Stop and stay stopped, for as long as it took. Somewhere in the Pacific, in a boat that had just put 2 torpedoes into a freighter and had a destroyer coming for it in return, the crew went still. Machinery that could be shut down was shut down. The air conditioning stopped because the air conditioning made noise, and noise was the one thing that could kill all 70-odd of them at once. Ventilation stopped with it. Men lay in their bunks or stood at their stations and did nothing, because doing nothing used less oxygen than doing something, and oxygen was now a resource with a countdown attached to it. Nobody knew exactly how long they would be down. That depended on the destroyer overhead, on how patient its captain was, on how much fuel he had to spend hunting a boat he could hear but not see. It could be 40 minutes. It could be most of a day. What the crew actually experienced during that wait was sound, and almost nothing else. A destroyer hunting a submerged boat used active sonar, sending out a sharp electronic ping and listening for the echo that bounced back off a hull. Inside the submarine, that ping was audible through the water and through the steel itself, a clear metallic note that men described as sounding almost gentle, almost musical, entirely at odds with what it meant. A steady ping, evenly spaced, told the crew the destroyer was still searching, still uncertain. A ping that came faster, or that seemed to sharpen and close in tone, told them they had been found and that the explosions were coming. There was no periscope to check, no way to see any of it. The entire battle for the men below decks was conducted by ear, in the dark, doing nothing. And that uncertainty is the real subject of this video, because it points at something almost nobody pictures correctly about submarine warfare in this war. These boats were not made to live underwater. They were made to survive on the surface most of the time and to disappear beneath it only when they had to, and every hour spent beneath it was an hour spent slowly running out of the one thing a human being cannot go without. Start with the ordinary rhythm, the one that governed a patrol on the days nothing was trying to kill anyone. An American fleet submarine, a Gato or a Balao, the standard boat of the Pacific War, ran on a cycle dictated by the sun. And the sun, for a diesel-electric submarine, was the enemy of concealment and the ally of survival at the same time. During daylight in any area where enemy aircraft or surface ships might be watching, the boat submerged. Underwater, it ran on its electric motors, powered by an enormous bank of lead-acid batteries, and it moved slowly and quietly, because speed on the batteries burned through their charge fast, and a boat with dead batteries and no diesel running is a boat that cannot dive again if it needs to. At night, it surfaced. This is the part people underestimate, because submarine suggests a vessel that belongs under the water, and for most of a war patrol, an American fleet boat spent more of its time on top of the water than beneath it. Surfacing at night was not a quiet moment of relief. It was the busiest period of the boat's day. The great diesel engines came to life and began doing 2 jobs at once: driving the boat forward at a speed the electric motors could never match, and running generators that poured current back into batteries that had been drained all day. Lookouts went up to the bridge in relays, scanning a dark horizon for anything that might be a threat, because a surface submarine is fast and far-ranging, but also blind in a different way. It has no depth to hide in, and its silhouette, low as it is, can still be picked up by a sharp-eyed watch, or, later in the war, by radar it could not detect until it was already found. Below decks, the night surface hours were when the boat did the things it physically could not do, submerged. The distilling plant, which made the boat's fresh water, ran harder. Trash and waste that had accumulated during the day were disposed of over the side. The cooks worked because a hot meal cooked while submerged used power and produced heat and moisture the boat could not easily get rid of underwater. So the biggest meal of the day often came at night, on the surface, while the diesels roared. Radio traffic was sent and received because a submerged boat running silent was also running deaf and mute to anything beyond a fairly short range. And the air itself was purged and replaced because, and this is the heart of the entire story, a submerged submarine cannot simply open a window. There was also a smaller, more human ritual that came with the night surface hours, and crews who wrote about their patrols afterward mention it more often than almost anything else. Men were allowed up onto the deck, a handful at a time, to stand in the open air. After a day spent in a hull that smelled of diesel and hot machinery and unwashed men, 5 or 10 minutes on a rolling steel deck under open sky was treated as something close to a luxury, even in a war zone, even with lookouts scanning the dark for a threat that could end the moment at any second. Smoking was permitted up there in a way it generally was not below, for the same reason candles and open flames were restricted inside the hull. A submerged boat's air was too precious and too easily fouled to spend any of it on a cigarette. That night surface routine was so central to how these boats operated that the entire rhythm of a patrol was built around it. A boat's daily position, its fuel consumption, its choice of route, all of it accounted for the assumption that there would be several hours of surface running in the dark. When that assumption held, submarine life was hard in the ordinary ways, cramped, humid, short on privacy, short on washing water, but it was manageable because the air was never allowed to degrade past the point where the crew simply reset it each night. Underwater, the boat's interior was a sealed volume of air shared by 70 to 80 men, and every one of those men was doing what every human being does continuously, taking in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. Over the course of a submerged day, the oxygen level in that air fell, and the carbon dioxide level rose, and there was no way to stop either process, only to slow it and manage it. Slowing it started with behavior. Crews were taught, formally and informally, that unnecessary movement and unnecessary exertion burned oxygen faster, and in a boat that might be submerged for many hours running from an attack, that lesson mattered. New men reporting to submarine duty went through training that covered this directly. Instructors explained, in plain terms, that a submarine's air was a stores item like fuel or food, consumed continuously and replaced only when circumstances allowed, and that a crew's own physical activity was one of the few variables anyone aboard could actually control. Managing the carbon dioxide side of the problem required equipment, canisters of a chemical absorbent, typically a soda-lime compound, that pulled carbon dioxide out of the air as it was circulated through them. Managing the oxygen side required banks of compressed oxygen carried aboard specifically for this purpose, which could be bled into the boat's atmosphere in controlled amounts to keep the air breathable. Both of those systems worked. Neither of them worked indefinitely. The absorbent canisters had a finite capacity and had to be changed, a job that fell to whichever crewman was assigned it, working through cases of the chemicals stacked in already crowded compartments. The oxygen banks held a finite volume of gas, checked and logged by the boat's officers the way fuel and water were logged, because in an emergency, those numbers were the only real measure of how much time the crew actually had left. On an ordinary submerged day, running the normal daylight routine, none of this came close to being a problem, because the boat would surface again in a matter of hours and the whole cycle would reset. Hatches open, diesels running, fresh air pouring through the boat, the accumulated staleness of the day blown out to sea. Even on those ordinary days, though, the crew felt the air change as the hours passed, in a mild version of what a longer emergency would later make severe. Afternoons submerged were consistently described as heavier than mornings. Men grew quieter, moved a little slower, and the last hour or two before the scheduled surfacing had a particular character to it that experienced hands recognized without needing to check a gauge. It was not dangerous. It was simply the ordinary cost of the arrangement, absorbed into the daily rhythm of the boat the same way heat and noise were, and it made the arrival of evening and the order to surface something the whole crew felt in a physical sense before anyone said a word about it. Daylight hours submerged were also, oddly, some of the quietest working hours a submarine crew had. With the boat running slow and silent on its batteries, there was comparatively little for off-watch men to do beyond maintenance that could be done without noise, letter writing that would sit unsent until the boat returned to port, cards, and reading. Some crews organized informal instruction during these stretches, more experienced men walking newer ones through systems on the boat they had not yet had to operate under pressure, because a submerged afternoon with nothing happening was exactly the kind of low-stakes moment in which that kind of teaching actually stuck. It was, in its own way, the quietest part of the boat's daily cycle, bounded on one side by the noise and labor of the night surface routine, and on the other by the ever-present possibility that the quiet afternoon would end not with a scheduled surfacing, but with a sonar contact and an order to rig for silent running in earnest. The problem arrived when the boat could not surface on schedule. And the clearest version of that problem was a submerged attack that went on for hours. When a submarine was located and depth charged, or when a convoy escort simply refused to leave the area, the standard response was to go deep, go quiet, and wait. That waiting is where the AIR problem stopped being background and became the thing the entire crew was living inside. With machinery shut down to reduce noise, ventilation fans off, and the boat sealed, the atmosphere inside began to degrade in a way men could feel. The early symptom, described consistently by men who went through long submerged periods, was a headache, a dull building pressure behind the eyes that came from rising carbon dioxide levels rather than from anything psychological. As the air continued to worsen, thinking slowed. Men described a heaviness, a difficulty concentrating on anything beyond the immediate task in front of them, in an environment where concentration was exactly what a torpedo attack or a silent evasion required. Simple mental tasks like reading a gauge correctly, doing arithmetic for a course change, or remembering an order given a few minutes earlier took longer and were more prone to small mistakes. The kind that were individually minor but collectively dangerous in a boat where every station depended on the next one functioning correctly. Some men reported a creeping drowsiness that fought against the fear that should have been keeping them alert. An odd and unsettling combination that several veterans specifically singled out as one of the strangest sensations of the entire war. Being frightened and profoundly sleepy in the same hour, for the same physical reason. And they simply endured it, because there was very little else to do. The officers managing the boat's atmosphere watched their gauges, bled oxygen from the banks when they judged it necessary, and made a calculation that was really a form of triage. How bad can the air get before it starts to matter more than the destroyer overhead? Depth charges that missed were frightening but survivable. An atmosphere that had degraded past a crew's ability to function was a different, quieter kind of danger, and it was the captain's job to end the silent running and take the risk of surfacing before that happened, if the tactical situation allowed it at all. There was no instrument that told a commander exactly where that line sat. It was judgment, built from experience and from watching his own crew's faces, weighed against a sonar operator's report on whether the hunter above still sounded close. Some of the longest submerged periods on record for American fleet boats ran the better part of a day, held down not by a single depth charge attack, but by a persistent hunter that would not leave. Those patrols are the ones veterans wrote about afterward in the greatest detail, because they were the closest the crew came to feeling, directly and physically, the fact that their boat did not actually belong underwater. It was borrowing the ability to be there, on a budget of stored oxygen and chemical absorbent, and the budget had a bottom. There was a second, quieter version of the same problem that had nothing to do with a single attack, an area so thick with enemy patrol activity that a boat could not safely surface at its normal hour, night after night. A captain in that situation faced a genuine dilemma. Stay down longer than planned and manage a crew breathing progressively worse air, or surface into a patrol zone and risk detection at the worst possible moment, with batteries already low and no guarantee of finding a safe window later. There was no clean answer. Some captains split the difference by surfacing only long enough to run the diesels and charge batteries at the minimum necessary level before diving again, accepting a partially stale atmosphere as the price of staying hidden. Crew accounts from these stretches describe a boat that smelled worse, felt heavier in the chest, and moved a little slower in every task, days after the immediate danger that had caused it had already passed, because degraded air did not reset instantly the moment a hatch opened. And a crew that had spent several consecutive days short on full ventilation took real time to recover. Men described feeling genuinely rested only after several full nights of unrestricted surface running had passed, well after the threat that caused the problem was gone, as though the air itself had to be paid back in installments before the crew felt like themselves again. It is worth setting the American experience against the other submarine force fighting the same war on the other side of the world, because the contrast sharpens exactly what made the American boats what they were. German U-boats began the war with much the same limitation: surface at night to run the diesels and charge batteries, submerge by day to hide. But as the Battle of the Atlantic turned against them, and Allied aircraft equipped with radar began finding and sinking U-boats specifically during those night surface periods, the German Navy pushed hard for a way to charge batteries without fully surfacing. The answer was the snorkel, a retractable air tube that let a submerged boat run its diesel engines just below the surface, drawing air down the tube and venting exhaust back up it, never exposing more than the tube itself. It worked, in the narrow sense that it let U-boats avoid full surfacing for much longer stretches, and by 1944, it had become standard equipment across much of the fleet. It also made life inside those boats considerably worse, in ways that had nothing to do with combat. Running submerged for extended periods on the snorkel meant the crew lived for days at a stretch in air that never really cleared, in a boat that pitched and rolled with a tube barely breaking the surface. When a wave closed over the intake valve, an automatic float mechanism was supposed to seal it, and when that happened, the diesel engines, still running and still demanding air, pulled it instead from inside the boat itself, producing a violent pressure drop that crewmen described as feeling like being punched in both ears at once, sometimes strong enough to rupture eardrums. Exhaust fumes that failed to clear properly added carbon monoxide to a carbon dioxide problem the crew was already managing. Men serving on snorkel-equipped boats in the last year of the war described long periods of headaches, nausea, and exhaustion that had become simply a normal condition of being at sea rather than the sign of an emergency it would have been earlier in the war. American submariners in the Pacific, fighting a less technologically desperate war in this particular respect, did not need to adopt anything like the snorkel with the same urgency, and their crews kept something the late war U-boat crews largely lost: a predictable night on the surface, with real air moving through a real open hatch most nights of most patrols. That difference is not a footnote. It is the difference between a submarine force whose men could count on a few clean hours of surface air most nights, and one whose men increasingly could not count on it at all. And it shaped in very concrete terms how bad the worst days actually got on each side, and how much reserve a crew had left in them when a genuine emergency arrived on top of an already degraded baseline. Which brings this back to where it started. A boat rigged for silent running, somewhere in the Pacific, a destroyer working the water above it, and a crew doing arithmetic they had done before. How long has it been? How does the air feel? How much is left in the banks? Is the man on watch slower than he was an hour ago? And is that carbon dioxide or is that fear? And does it matter which? Because the response is the same either way. Stay still, stay quiet, and wait for a captain topside, an enemy captain, an unwilling ally in this particular equation, to decide he has spent enough fuel on a hunt that isn't paying off. When he finally did, and the sound of his propellers faded into the general noise of the ocean. The order to come up to periscope depth and then to the surface was not simply a tactical decision. For the men below, it was the end of a slow physical ordeal that had nothing to do with the enemy's weapons and everything to do with basic biology. There was a particular sequence to it that men who lived through it remembered clearly. The boat tilting up and forward as it rose, the pressure in the ears changing, the sound of the sea sliding off the hull as the deck broke the surface, and then, before anything else, the hatch. The officer of the deck went up first, and the moment that hatch came open, the boat's stale, recycled, chemically scrubbed air rushed out past him in a way men described almost like an exhalation, the whole vessel breathing out at once. Then the diesels caught, and with them came the intake fans, and cold night air, full of salt, entirely unremarkable in any other context, began pouring down through the boat from bow to stern. Men who had spent the last several hours breathing their own exhaled breath over and over, filtered through chemical canisters and stretched with bottled oxygen, felt it hit their lungs and understood more clearly than any instructor could have explained it to them exactly what a submarine actually was. Not a vessel built to live beneath the sea. A surface ship that could vanish beneath it for a while, on borrowed time, and that had to come back up every single night it possibly could, because the alternative was to run out of the one thing no amount of steel or discipline could replace.